Hey, it's Pastor Pete here. I am working on a project that was started out as writing a summary of this book, chapter by chapter, How Your Church Family Works by Peter Steinke, for my own review as I prepare to enter a new contract, but also to make a video for each chapter that could save prospective and existing STMs time in just I was thinking of calling it books in bites. And as I finished the first chapter's notes, I realized that this could be useful for leadership teams in a church. And so I'm making this video. I'm not naming specific places because I might use it in various places. And I'm going to make this video as an introduction uh, on chapter one and just see how it goes. I'll share it and I'll see what response I get. Share it with specific people. So Peter Steinke is one of the key thinkers and practitioners in deliberate interim work in churches. He's a consultant, lots of experience, and he follows in the footsteps of Edwin Friedman, who's kind of seen as the academic guru of all of this systems thinking, applied stuff. And before him, a guy by the name of Murray, that's his last name, I've forgotten his first name, who first started writing about systems with relationship to families. So I'm largely presenting what Steinke says in chapter one, which is called Conceptualizing Emotional Processes, or that's part one of the book. And chapter one is the concept of a system. So I'm presenting what he says there in my own words. I tend to be somewhat regularly unhappy with his writing style and his way of illustrating. And so I'm adding in a story of my own to illustrate. So I start with, in the concept of a system, that it is important to think of a church organization as an organism, not a machine. We're kind of coming out of a time when we thought everything could be understood as if it was a machine. We're learning that's not true. An organism is a complex system of cells or components or organs that each have their own operations. An organism made up of humans, such as the church, adds the element of each human part having its own volition or will and its own internal and external motivators, positive and negative. Each has their own unique positive and negative triggers in the life that they live. There may be two cells that are at odds with each other in the organism. Yet we must understand that problem as having been created or allowed by the whole of the organism, because it's all tied together. So if someone is mad at the bulletin editor and regularly makes negative critiques of their work, even as the editor tries to meet the expectations of the critic, we need to learn that the whole system is allowing this conflict to happen, and maybe even depends on it happening for some reason. Both individuals also play a role in the conflict, not just the one or the other. Often we want to identify who the bad guy is, so to speak, but often it's a mutually dependent thing. So I'm going to introduce an example story that I lived, that I experienced as a student pastor, and that I believe illustrates quite well, at least to me in my mind, these principles. Here's the introduction of that story. In one church I served, there were two key leadership people who had a well-established pattern of being at odds. This was especially evident in congregational meetings. If the one was for the motion, the other seemed to instinctively be against it. And so if you've been part of old-fashioned congregational meetings, there may be 2 or 3 things that are proposed as motions and need to be discussed as a congregation. And this was totally consistent. If the one was for it, the other was against it, automatically. The subject did not matter. And they would soon get out of hand, arguing disruptively across the aisle, making everyone uncomfortable and holding the meeting hostage. So that's the presenting problem. One of the things I've learned in ministry, in life, and particularly in STM work and the learning about it, is that the presenting problem is rarely the real issue. I have another story I could tell of a family situation another pastor was dealing with, and the teenage son was being presented to that pastor as the problem. He was being rebellious and disruptive. And yet from the story, there seemed to be other things at work. And in the end, it turned out that the father was an alcoholic, secretly. But the son had a pretty good idea and was trying to honestly call that out. And both parents came down on him for it. Presenting problem there was the teenage son, but the real issue was something else. So I'm going to repeat the part of the story I just told, but I want to give you a question to answer. And then if you're watching this as a video or even reading it later, you can pause and write down what your answer would be to that question. The question is, or for discussion or reflection, how would you summarize the presenting problem in this example? In one church I served, there were 2 key leadership people who had a well-established pattern of being at odds. This was especially evident in congregational meetings. If the one was for something, the other seemed to be instinctively against it. The subject did not matter, and they would quickly get out of hand, arguing disruptively across the aisle, making everyone uncomfortable. How would you summarize the presenting problem in that example? Stienke says, a church system is a rich complexity of interdependent parts where the whole is greater than the parts, and where we cannot understand one thing without considering at least one other, and probably 25 others. That's my addition. Here's a quote from the book. Rather than, and you could think of the 2 people in the story I just told, rather than thinking that A causes B, we see that A and B are mutual influences on one another. A and B are both influencer and influenced. They are co-causal. Every cause is an effect, and every effect is a cause. That's a great one to think about, but it took me a while to understand that because I was so invested in identifying A or B being the problem. It was hard for me to see that they depend on each other. Clashes within a church system are not linear and predictable like in the physics of a pool ball striking another pool ball. Or if you curl, a curling rock striking another curling rock. It is more like a pool ball striking, gently of course, a gerbil sitting on the pool table. We can't exactly predict what the gerbil will do in the same way that we can predict what hitting another ball would do. An even better example, a gerbil colliding with a gerbil. add to that one gerbil has been traumatized before by run-ins with pool balls and gerbils, and therefore thinks crashing into other gerbils is normal and expected, well, and you start to get the picture of how complicated this is. A church organism is, in a similar way, a really complex set of more than just one-on-one relationships, pool ball to pool ball. Each participant has so many variables that there is no one formula for sorting things out. Formula as in a physics formula, E equals mc squared or whatever like that. It is helpful to start by looking at the church as a relationship system that involves a package or web of emotional relationships. Stienke writes this: relationship systems have a unique dimension, and he's talking about human ones here. What most distinguishes relationship systems from other systems are emotional processes. This is where I began to start to appreciate the need for us to learn, in church leadership especially, emotional or relational intelligence. You've heard of an intelligence quotient. Well, there are rankings like that for emotion and for relationship as well. So I'll return to the background story, or to the story that I gave as an example, and give some more background. Some deeper conversation and exploration revealed that these two people and their spouses had owned a property together 30 years before, like before I was involved. One of the people, who were now still in conflict, felt that they did not get a fair deal on the sale of that property that long time ago. So this was the root of that person's reactionary responses to anything the other person said or did. So here's something to reflect on. How would you now describe the problem? And I challenge you to see if you can name, without repeating details of the story, the presenting problem and the root cause in one or two sentences or short phrases. I'll repeat the story. Deeper conversation and exploration revealed that these two people and their spouses had owned a property together 30 years before. One of the two that were in conflict was pretty clear that they felt they did not get a fair deal on the sale of that property a long time ago. And so this was the emotional root of her reactionary responses to anything the other person said. What's the presenting problem and the root cause? All organisms have a preferred state of operating or being. It's their baseline, their normal. They naturally, like the human body, prefer that balanced state and have automatic processes that will help them hold that balance. The state is called homeostasis by academics, meaning things staying the same or staying predictable. And so organisms, like a church culture, has the same desire. All human gatherings have some desire like that. Stienke says, when subjected to virus, injury, or malfunctioning organs, the body's homeostatic forces go to work. Our immune system is most actively part of that. If balance is reclaimed in that, there is health. So you have the flu, stuff happens in the body to correct that, and health is regained, but you're miserable for a time. And there's, of course, a difference between things like flu, viruses, and stuff like that, and cancer. And so those are some illustrations that we'll get to in another video if I keep this up. And of course, if balance is not reclaimed, there is ongoing sickness or poor health. And there, I'll say as an STM, that sometimes a congregation, even a person, will continue in rather poor health from a health perspective, and that will be their normal. And they won't even know that something's really badly wrong. The reality of life, both for the human body and for organisms made up of humans, is that there are constantly challenges to that balance, and there should be. Any change is a possible threat to balance. So we have patterns of behavior within the system that keep it in balance or restore it quickly when it's shook a little. As a result, when a pattern that is comfortable for most of an organism is radically disrupted or disturbed, we experience what we call culture shock. There are stories like that. I have known people who experienced culture shock when the pastor did not wear a tie. I'll even tell it as my own story. I've had the experience of people not being able to hear a word I said because I didn't preach with a tie on. That was a culture shock for them, and they were not well equipped to adjust. One such shock many of us over 30 years old have experienced is the image of planes deliberately flying into buildings. Planes weren't supposed to do that. Not intentionally, not in order to cause damage and kill people. And if you're like me, for years afterwards, when you saw a plane anywhere near a skyscraper, something would happen in you out of that culture shock. Another example of a shocking change away from a familiar pattern has been the COVID pandemic. And we all do talk about returning to normal. And some of us have realized that what will be normal now will never be what we had before. And that is sad. And that is worth naming as a point of grief. I'm going to add a bit here. So how you react to those changes. Some people have a very, very low threshold for change. And so they react anxiously. And that's going to be the next video that I'll likely make, is about how anxiety works in all of this. But just beware that that is a pattern for a system of an organism of human beings. Even as that need for continuity and sameness is there, organisms also need to be flexible. Adaptable. And I have a whole lot of teaching on that as well. Adaptable versus technical. All living things grow and develop. I mean, have you ever seen a living thing that never changes, never grows, never changes? Stienke writes, therefore, change is as normal as the norms to which we've been accustomed. That one's worth pondering too. Therefore, change is as normal as the norms to which we've become accustomed. In the Canadian Christian Reformed Church, particularly, the founding generations of the churches that we have today were traumatized people. That's a theory that I have that I'd love to do research on more, but I have lots of stories to illustrate it. And they were suspicious of emotion. And they longed, they had homesickness for the way things had been back home, and really what that meant was before World War II. And so they fought to retain cultural habits here in Canada that were no longer relevant and yet had deep meaning for them. I didn't understand that at the time. I understand that now. I still think a lot of it was inappropriate. And so any change, such as moving from using the organ in worship to playing guitars, or bringing, of all things, a drum into the church, drum set into the church, became change challenges for them out of their emotional background. Okay, I'll end that insert. That's for another video. There is a time for homeostasis, and there is a time for asking, why are you doing the same old thing? Isn't it time to try something new? System thinking, here's a quote from the book. System thinking instructs us to look at how the whole is wired together, how it's all connected. In a human system, the parts are arranged into a whole through functioning positions. That's, again, another topic. By functioning in a specific way, each person contributes to the system's balance, or even ongoing imbalance that has become acceptable. That's my words. The quote finishes with, as long as everyone functions in the same way, the arrangement is stable. That quote always brings to mind for me a small town I served a church in Ontario, where one year the ministers all got together. We were going to clean up the town drunk. It was the same guy for like 3 or 4 years. And so we got together and got him into treatment, and he was off of his street corner. And 2 weeks later, there was a new town drunk sitting there. It was like it was a role that the system needed for balance. I'm not saying it was, but it was like that. So I'll go back to my example now. These two people from two different couples, one a male and one a female, would disrupt homeostasis in the congregation, and yet were also part of its normal, because they were always this way for as long as most people could remember. They were founding members of this church, and no one had solved the problem that they had between them. When I was there as a student pastor, I experienced their disruption firsthand. And I'll just say it was a huge learning moment for me. Let me finish that story off. That unsatisfactory sale of co-owned property turned out to be a key motivation to this predictable, repeated conflict that held the congregational meetings hostage each time an important subject was discussed. The dispute had nothing to do with the subject at hand, even though the words seemed to be a dispute around the decision to be made. Linear, non-relational thinking that wants to solve the presenting issue could just order them to be silent in meetings, and so seemingly solve the problem. But it would not address the systemic, relational, emotional root issues. A loop of negative and disruptive behavior had been created and perpetuated over 30 years. My experience in life and pastoring, and as an STM since that incident, has shown me that most churches have disruptive dynamics like this, sometimes even between key leaders. In that situation that I talked about, she ran a great coffee break ministry in the church, and he was a long-standing and trusted and wise treasurer. They couldn't be faulted necessarily as good leadership in the church, but they had this thing. This is important stuff to get an understanding of, and I've already said way more than I intended. It's been hard for me to learn and understand this myself because I grew up in a culture that was suspicious of emotion and wanted to believe that it was good at rationality, at being reasonable, thinking things through, not feeling them through. And I partly reread these books and make summaries so that I can learn it better. And there is a teaching that if you teach something, you also learn it better. And that's what I'm doing. Now some pointing towards what's next or what kind of solutions are available. Some first steps in learning to work with systems thinking are to learn to monitor and name your own emotions. Many of us of Northern European heritage are awful at this. You know who else are awful at this and where I learned to start to do this? I learned it when I started working at an addiction treatment center. And addicts are horrible at when they're first into recovery, at identifying their feelings, at even noticing their feelings, and then being able to put into words what they're feeling. Another step is to learn to what is called self-differentiate. I won't even explain it, just get you intrigued by that term. Part of that is learning to watch the anxiety level in yourself and in the system. What happens to you when you are anxious? Do you know? How do you behave when you are anxious? Do you know? That question, often loved ones know better how to answer better for us than we ourselves. Where does the anxiety start in the congregational system when it arises? Does it often come from the same person, the same family or household, the same clan? What might the systems thinking reasons behind that be? And so on. But those will have to wait. I would appreciate feedback on this. I'll put it up as the full length video, but I'm even half thinking now I should have probably cut it into 3 different pieces. How does it come across for you? I wouldn't mind to know. Thank you for listening.